Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the planets. So in the last several episodes, we've been looking at the zodiac, the components of the zodiac, that is the elements and the modalities, kind of going through that in more depth. And now I want to cover kind of the next and honestly most important thing in astrology, which is the planets themselves. That's the last piece of the zodiac which we haven't covered in terms of where it gets a lot of the meaning for the signs, is the rulers of the each sign. But the rulers are just the planets, and the planets have more function than just simply being the rulers of the signs. They're actually the most important piece of astrology. It's what all of astrology is really based off of effectively. And so in this episode, I want to go through what are the planets, why are they so important for astrology, what do they represent, and kind of get a sense for how we group them, organize them, and kind of just a broad overview of them. And then in the following episodes, I want to go through each of the planets one by one. We'll look at each of them more in depth. So, why the planets? Why are they so important? Well, if we think back to ancient times, right, people didn't have electricity. And so in the evenings, at night, the only thing you really could do was look up at the sky. There's not really much else because it's too dark. And so what people noticed as they looked up at the sky every night is, first and foremost, you have the moon has a cycle to it, right? It's changing over the course of a month. But the next thing people would have noticed is that the sky itself has just a magnificent amount of stars. And if you've ever gone out into the desert or gone somewhere away from civilization and actually been able to look up at the sky at night where there's no light pollution, it's really magnificent. It's truly impressive how many stars are in the sky. And so people would have obviously been able to see this, been able to notice this and watch this and observe this and see how it kind of operates. And what you'll notice if you watch it every night is that the stars actually are fairly static. They don't really move. They'll move over the course of the year in the sense that it's almost like if you have an image and you're just kind of slowly panning across it, right? You have this very long image and you just kind of slowly pan your viewpoint across from, left to right or something, or up to down. That's effectively what we see over the course of the year with the, quote, movement of the stars. It's not really the stars moving so much as it's the Earth orbiting the sun. And as the Earth orbits the sun, our kind of vantage point of space, right? That's what all the zodiac and the constellation stars are. It's just our vantage point out into space is going to slowly shift as the Earth is now in different spots throughout the year. And so the only movement that the stars had is this movement as a result of the Earth's orbit, right? But they all stay static in relationship to each other. However, the people watching this ultimately observed that there were a handful of stars that did in fact seem to move on their own, not related. They didn't stay static with the rest of the stars in the sky. And so they called these stars the wandering stars, which is where we get the word planet. Planet just simply means wandering stars, because they looked like stars, but they moved. And what people observed is that these planets would slowly move on their own little rhythm, their own little cycles that they had, much like the moon. The moon has its own cycle, its own kind of path that it follows through the sky. And the stars, or the planets, I should say, did the same thing. They had their own path, their own cycles. Now, some of them were quicker, some of them were slower, right? And over the course of tens, hundreds, thousands of years, people noted these different cycles. They noted these different movements and jotted things down. That was the origin of astrology. It was people watching and observing and then taking note of everything possible they could. What happened on this day when this planet was here, when that planet was there. And so that was the origins of astrology. But what's the purpose, or what can we kind of intuit from using the stars like this? Well, first and foremost, if they're on a cycle, much like the moon, that means there is a rhythm to them, right? That means there's a predictable recurrence. If you go around a circle, at some point you're going to be back to a spot you've already been. And so this is the beauty of looking at things from a cyclical perspective. Once you make a full revolution, you now have a predictable framework from which to, follow. You've been on that path before. And so that's the nature of the planets. They're cycles. They're markers of cycles. Astrology is the study of time, essentially, but from a cyclical viewpoint. And instead of marking time from a just length, essentially, like if you think of a clock, what does a clock measure, right? Well, you've got 3 different hands. You've got the hour hand, the minute hand, the second hand. They all measure time, but in different increments, right? And so as they move around the same circle, they tell us different things based on where they're at. If you have the minute hand at, say, 3, it means it's, 3 sets of 5, or 3 sets of 5 minutes, 15 minutes, right? If the second hand is at the 3, it's 3 sets of 5 seconds, right? They represent different things, but they're following the same cycle. And that's kind of what the planets are. They're just giant clocks in space, or clock hands, I should say, in space. Except instead of representing physical time, right, length of time, they coincide with various aspects of our lives, whether it's personality things, events, kind of cultural things, natural occurrences. For whatever reason, and this is something that's, I would say, hotly debated in astrology, and it's definitely something that a lot of people like to look at to try and debunk astrology and say, well, how can you prove that one causes the other? I don't know if it's a cause necessarily so much as a synchronicity. They happen at the same time, and so we can use one to kind of gauge the other. That's the way I look at it personally. But again, different people have different beliefs on it, and that's a whole topic for a different day. But either way, the planets represent cycles, and they all deal with different cycles. And so that's why they're so fundamental for astrology, because they give us a window into seeing cycles of the future as well as cycles of the past, as well as an ability to look at what's the current cycle. Where am I at currently? All right. Additionally, when we think of a birth chart, right, it's a snapshot in time. And just to simplify this, the reason we can use a birth chart and get a sense for who someone is and what's going to happen to them, why that functions, if we think again of a clock. If I set the clock to 3 o'clock, right? The hour hand is at 12, the minute hand's at 3. I know that the hour hand's at 3, the minute hand's at 12. I know based on that setup, right, based on that aspect, that if we move the minute hand 5 minutes backwards, it's 12:55. And if we move it 5 minutes forwards, it's going to be 3:05. I think I said that wrong, but you get the idea. We know based on what we can see of the current snapshot of that clock where things will be at if we shift it, right? Because we understand the nature of a clock. And so a birth chart, astrology, it operates the same way. If we look at a birth chart, we know this is a snapshot of a multitude of different cycles. If we play those cycles forward, we can see what is going to occur. And if we play those cycles backwards, we can see what came before, what led to that point. And so that's the beauty of astrology, and it's the beauty of the planets. Now, as I said, the planets kind of represent different things. And so we have different ways we can group them to kind of keep ourselves organized, but also get a sense for, okay, where are we at with different things? So, first grouping is just from a kind of astronomical perspective. You have the inner planets, the outer planets, and then what I would call the generational planets, which are, I'll explain in a moment. So for the inner planets, we have Mercury and Venus, right? They're inner because they are on the inside orbit of Earth, right? They are closer to the sun than the Earth is. And so what this means is, both astronomically but also in a birth chart, is that the Mercury and Venus will always appear in the sky within a certain amount of degrees from the sun. They always stay close to the sun. In the case of Mercury, it's never more than, I believe it's about 45 or so degrees away. Venus can get a little farther. So that means that Mercury will never be more than 1 sign away from the sun, and Venus will never be more than 2 signs away from the sun. So if you know somebody's sun sign, you can guess with, pretty decent accuracy, much better chances than 1 in 12, what their Venus or their Mercury sign is going to be. The outer planets are going to be Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. They obviously are past the Earth, which means they don't stay close to the sun. That also means their retrograde cycles operate differently. And a retrograde cycle just means, from our vantage point on Earth, the planet appears to be moving backwards. And it just has to deal with the geometry of where the planets are in space. It's not actually moving backwards, right? It's still moving forward in its orbit, but just as it appears from Earth, it looks like it's moving backwards. So that's all a retrograde is. But the outer planets always go retrograde as they, on a chart, begin to as the sun kind of begins to get to the opposition, right? As it moves, they move as far away from possible as the sun on a birth chart or on any chart. That's when they will go retrograde. And it's hard to explain this without visualizing. It's much easier to make sense of it if you can visualize it. But just know that they have different retrograde cycles compared to the inner planets. The inner planets have a bit more defined cycles, whereas the outer planets tend to be a bit more straightforward as to how they operate. Now, then we get to the generational planets. And what are the generational planets? Well, that would be Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. The planets up through Saturn are what is visible with the naked eye. And so that's the planets that the ancients, when they devised the astrological system, were able to see and keep track of. We didn't discover Uranus until the 1800s. Neptune, I can't remember if it was the 1800s or early 1900s. And then Pluto was discovered in the early 1900s. And so for the kind of generational planets, they're a bit more modern, right? Or at least in our understanding of them. And additionally, they move slow, right? The further away from the sun you get, the slower a planet moves around the sun, or at least in terms of crossing the zodiac. And so the outer planets move so slow that everyone in a generation tends to have them in the same sign. For example, I'm a millennial. Pretty much every millennial has Pluto in Scorpio, right? The boomers all have Pluto in Leo for the most part. And so this is the thing with the outer planets, is they tend to move so slow that you see them clustered amongst generations. They also tend to have a bit more kind of cultural, societal level of effect as well. So as far as the rulerships go, modern astrology has tried to shoehorn the generational planets in as rulers of certain signs. I personally don't follow that. I've never been able to make that work in practice. I think there is some sense to the idea that they have certain levels of strength in certain signs, but I've personally never found that to make sense, either conceptually or just from a practical standpoint. So I don't use the modern rulers. I tend to use the kind of the original rulers, which is the planets up through Saturn. So that's the first way we organize things, right? Astronomically. Second way, we can organize the planets based on certain groupings. And so the first grouping is going to be kind of what they mean. First, you would have the sun and the moon. We'll call them the luminaries. In an astrology world, we consider them planets, but obviously the sun is a giant ball of gas, it's a star, and the moon is, well, it's a moon. But for the sake of astrology, we consider them the luminaries because they give off light. The sun, obviously, the bright light during the day, the greater light. The moon the minor light, the light at night, right? The moon actually reflects the light of the sun. But if you've ever been in, say, the desert where there's no light pollution, you go outside when it's a full moon, it actually lights up the ground pretty well. It's a pretty unique experience, especially if you can understand what it's like when there's a new moon and it's pitch black. So it is a light, but it's a lesser light, and it's a reflective light. It doesn't have its own light per se. So you have the two luminaries. Then you would have the inner planets, but in this case, we would put them up to Mars. And the reason being is they deal with our kind of personal attributes, our more personal nature. Then you would have the social planets, which is Jupiter and Saturn, which represent beginning to get a bit more collective in nature. And then you have, again, the generational planets. Another way we could group these is by their masculinity and femininity, right? Masculinity and femininity in astrology is, I think modern astrology has tried to, in some cases, try and deviate away from it. Some people would call it a nocturnal or diurnal, that is a day or a night planet. In either case, the masculine planets would be the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter. The feminine planets being the Moon, Venus, and Saturn, with Mercury kind of being a true neutral. It tends to float in either direction based on what it's around or what it's ruled by. Mercury, in all cases, in pretty much every system, is always a true neutral. It's a very, very interesting in that way. The masculine planets then tend to be a bit more outward going, right? Whereas the feminine planets tend to be a bit more recessive, right? It's that same kind of project outward, project inward kind of dynamic we've discussed with the elements. And then the last way we kind of organize them is into the benefics and malefics, and then kind of the neutral. And what does this word benefic or malefic mean? Well, if we look at the root, we would think, oh, that means good or bad, right? But really what it means in astrology is how soft or harsh is it in its kind of attributes. So the benefic planets tend to give things freely. They tend to bring a lot of easy, soft things that give us stuff, right? And the benefics are going to be Jupiter and Venus, right? They're the qualities that they have tend to be very giving and soft and easy to deal with. The malefic planets tend to be harsher. They deal with harsher qualities, and they're much rougher around the edges and much more abrasive in the way that they act. This would be Mars and Saturn. In Vedic astrology, they also consider the sun a malefic. I tend to think the sun has like a kind of a minor malefic, and I would, in some ways, I do wonder if the moon has kind of a minor beneficness to it, but I tend to find the moon very sensitive. So I don't know if I'd quite go that far. But there is arguments for the sun also being somewhat malefic. And again, malefic doesn't mean it's bad. It simply means it's harsh, right? It's abrasive. There's a harder quality to it. But that harder quality also makes them sturdier and stronger in some ways. And then lastly, you have Mercury, which is true neutral, again, as we've mentioned. And then you have the luminaries, the sun and the moon. And so that's all the way we kind of organize things, we structure things. That's the gist of why we use the planets, right? Again, the cyclical nature. They show us windows, snapshots of time, as well as allow us to look forward or backward on the cycle, right? So that's it for today. I think over the next several episodes, we're going to go through each planet individually. So if you're interested in that, obviously stick around, keep listening. Thank you for listening thus far. And if you are ever interested in a reading or you just have any questions, you can always find me at james@jdastrology.com. I'm a professional astrologer. So, thanks for listening.